I'm Sonia Lawrence. I'm the professor here at Osgoode, and I'm the director of the Institute for Feminist Legal Studies, which is one of the sponsors of today's talk. It's really, I can't tell by looking whether or not you're from the law school, but assuming that there are at least some people in here who are not from the law school, welcome, and thank you for coming. And it's really a pleasure for me to be able to introduce two distinguished scholars for this event, which is co-sponsored with the Center for Feminist Research at York. So mainly I need to thank our speakers today, Professor Margaret Thornton from the Australian National University Law School and York Professor Emerita of Philosophy, Lorraine. Both are really well-known feminist scholars in their field, and so the opportunity to hear from both of them in a kind of conversation is really a rare treat. Margaret's work mostly focuses on women in the law, ranging from studies of women in the legal profession to a 1996 book on women in the legal profession in Australia, and an ongoing project on gender and corporate law firms. Her most recent book was published in 2012, and it's called Privatising the Public University, The Case of Law. And for this book, she interviewed 145 legal academics. You can imagine how long they might have talked for. In 40 law schools in Canada, the UK, New Zealand, and Australia. And so in that book, she explores how changes in funding regimes have altered the way in which students approach higher education, as well as the means by which academics govern and undertake teaching and research. So the work she's going to present today is connected to these concerns about the changing climate in higher education. And we're very pleased to welcome as commentator Professor Emerita Lorraine. She's been a part of the York community since 1987, and she's best known for her 1991 book, What Can She Know? Feminist Theory and the Construction of Knowledge, which was a path-breaking book in feminist epistemology and has been reprinted several times. So much of her recent work has focused on developing an ecological science-based theory of epistemology, which is, I took that straight from the title. That's straight from the cut lines on the back. But her general focus on questions of where and how knowledge is made and recognized, leave her kind of ideally placed to reflect on the ideas that Margaret's going to offer us today. So we have about 40 minutes for Margaret's talk, 10 to 15 minutes of commentary from Professor Code, and then we'll have questions which I'll moderate. The talk is being video recorded, so I'm going to run around with a microphone that does not amplify. It only captures your questions for the tape. So let me invite Margaret to come and begin.
Thank you, Mary Jane, for inviting me to come to Osgoode. Forgive me for being slightly hoarse. That's one of the downsides of travelling around the world, I think. So I'm talking about then the construction of the ideal academic, the Mirage of Merit, looking at the impact of the corporatized university, which I think perhaps from walking around the law school here, you do get some sense of, if I may say that without sounding that I'm critical of my hosts, but I think this is a phenomenon that is certainly not peculiar to York. It's something that we're finding, as a globally. And I mean, I'm coming from an Australian perspective, where Australia and New Zealand have really been to the fore in terms of the corporatisation of the university, which is a sort of interesting turnaround from having been sort of passionate supporters of social liberalism a nanosecond ago. Things change, and now there's support for commodification, and I think that is a particularly interesting phenomenon. I've looked, of course, at the UK, which is fairly similar in terms of its attitudes, and New Zealand. And Canada has been a little bit slower to embrace the corporate message, but maybe that's changing. And I think we see that nation states learn from one another, and the OECD has played a significant role, I think, in actually encouraging the new knowledge economy. Oh, is this working? Good. Yes. So with particular regard then to the academy, that we see something of the so-called feminization of the academy in terms of numbers, so that we find overall in many parts of the world now that more than 50% of students are female, and in law it's higher, up to 70% in law, which again is a dramatic change from zero a century ago. In terms of academics, it'd be 40 to 50%. Then the precise percentage varies. And so just looking at this superficially, the idea is that numerosity equals, equality. But I'm suggesting then that once the tipping point has been reached, that we see a fear of feminization, that women are going to take over, and you hear this all the time, and it's part of the popular culture. It's repeated in the media ad infinitum. And often when women do move into an occupation, we see either a notion of male flight, or we find a hierarchization of two gendered spheres. So with male flight, we saw that, for example, more than a century ago, in terms of secretarial work, which was done only by men, and women moved in. Of course, it meant that the status lowered and the men fled, so it became entirely feminized. And we see that with bank tellers and some other areas. So that has been one of the concerns. On the part of men, would men actually flee from the academy as a result of so-called feminization? But the more typical response we see, particularly with prestigious organisations, is that a hierarchy emerges, two gendered spheres, which is typical of most corporate organisations and of the legal profession, for example. So you see with this sort of crude diagram I have, with the apex tends to be one that is masculinized, it's associated with authority and autonomy, and the pyramidal base then is seen to be feminized, where the positions are managed or manned. And we do see that in the legal profession, which I think is interesting. But so any area where one finds it is prestigious, there is notions of control, domination, the apex then is masculinized. So I'm suggesting then this argument that academic capitalism has entrenched this gender organizational pyramid despite numerosity in terms of the numbers of women and the feminist critiques and equity initiatives that have been common throughout the Western world for the last 40 years or so. And so I'll be elaborating a little bit on this notion of academic capitalism, which I'm suggesting has spread like a disease throughout the world. But first of all, we go back, though, to the notion of merit, the mystique of merit, I've called it. And so it's assumed then that merit applies when a person when a position is advertised and a person applies, that the best person for the job is going to be appointed. This is the notion of merit. It's assumed to be egalitarian and a fair means of allocating scarce resources. And this notion that the best person for the job is appointed is the basis of liberal democracy. So we see that as a very important stabilising force within understandings of democracy, that the best person is appointed. But of course, it's sometimes forgotten that merit has two facets: one, an objective facet, and secondly, a subjective or interpretive dimension. So the objective aspect, one's looking at the sort of factors that one might see on a CV, the qualifications of a person, which institution they attended, their employment history, publications, grants, teaching experience, all those things that are listed. You're very familiar with all of that. But none of that really means anything without interpretation. So who decides what institution a person went to? What is the status of that institution? It doesn't speak for itself. The employment history, is it relevant or not? And similarly, the publications, where did they appear? Was it in an international refereed journal, which is now the relevant criteria? And the grants, were they, international or national competitive grants or local grants and so on, the nature of the teaching experience. All those things have to be interpreted in the context of a particular position. So who decides? That is important, the values that are brought to bear in making that decision. It's not something that can be weighed up in a test tube at all. So we see that merit then is a malleable concept. Now, 40 years ago, Lippmann Blumen wrote about the concept of homosocial reproduction, so a notion borrowed from science. So the idea of replacing like with like. And the homo there is from the homoios, from the Greek, meaning like. It doesn't mean same-sex there, although it may, of course. And so it's that idea of the mirror image appointing someone who looks like the decision maker is seen to be the best person for the job. Now, of course, anti-discrimination legislation has been enacted in the West the last 40, 50 years. So the visible signifiers of identity, sex, race, sexuality, age, and so on, are unlawful. It's unlawful to make decision on those on the basis of a person's identity. But I think it's interesting that fitting in is sometimes used as a tacit criterion. So fitting in is never appears in an advertisement. I have never seen, whether this person's going to fit in, but it's a curious criterion. But nevertheless, it is crucial. It plays a crucial role in the mind of the decision maker. And so it may be that those signifiers of identity, in an overt way, may be determined to be unlawful, but nevertheless may operate informally in making a decision about whether X is the best person for the job rather than Y, and so on. In terms of academic positions, I think it's also interesting to see the role of the referee. So, you can't get a job without someone actually vouching for you, someone who is an established academic. So that referee, acts as a sort of patron, and so, the person who's going to be, listed, people who are going to be listed as referees also play an important role then in determining the best person for the job. Now, of course, belying these notions of fitting in and so on, we always have a notion of exceptionality. So, and this is one of my favourite examples. This appeared on the front page of a national newspaper in Australia when Susan Crennan was appointed to the High Court, the Superior Court in Australia. And this is how it appeared: Woman of Merit joins High Court. And I wrote about this subsequently and said, just imagine a headline which said, "Man of Merit joins High Court." It's really unimaginable that such a phrase would appear. And so that there was a question then about the merit of this appointee. So there had to be assurance to readers that this was an exceptional woman who actually satisfied the merit criteria. Now, the concepts then of merit have changed over time, and particularly because of changes within the prevailing context. And so I've just in brief here referred to the notion of universities upside down, where we see a completely different idea about the role of universities within the new knowledge economy. And so we see that in many nation states, there's been a move away from a focus on agriculture, natural resources and manufacturing to knowledge. So this is the new knowledge economy. And so that as a result of that, we see notions of massification, all these rather ugly words sort of come together here. So it means putting many more students through university, expanding the system significantly. And it's part of this neoliberal turn. So a move away from social liberalism, which lasted for really quite a short time, to embrace of conservative values in terms of privatising notions of the public good, which included, of course, welfare, utilities and so on, but particularly higher education, which had been, which of course is my interest, which had been seen to be a public good, then became subject to the market values. So moving from the public sphere, from civil society, to being commercialised, so that the cluster of words then associated with this move, competition, commodification, consumerism, and globalisation. So competition, as soon as you're talking about the market, you're talking about winners and losers, individuals competing with others. Not just individuals, students competing, academics competing, institutions competing with one another, and countries competing with one another. So Lyotard had suggested more than 20 years ago that knowledge was now the basis of competition between nation states rather than land, so that knowledge everywhere is significant. So we see nation states then placing pressure upon their higher education system to produce more knowledge workers, to produce more knowledge in terms of research. We see the commodification of education. So education is sold to consumers or customers rather than students. Now, in Australia, there was a dramatic change so that by 2004, we find something like 24% of the entire university population were international students. And so that the idea is because international students can be charged at a higher level of, in terms of fees, which is, common all over the world, that higher education actually moved up to the third largest export earner in Australia. I mean, that is just an extraordinary thing. From the notion of free education, free higher education, which prevailed in the 70s, and 15 years later there was a change, and we, gradually fees were ratcheted up. Although the system that operates in Australia is that they weren't called fees, what students paid, but a contribution. So it was called HECS, which means the Higher Education Contribution Scheme, which means students paid a certain amount, but they did not have to repay it until they received a certain level of income in the workplace. So as a result of that, there was extraordinary degree of receptivity to this change in Australia. That system has now been emulated in the UK and elsewhere. And I mean, there were demonstrations by students at the beginning, but they became quieter and quieter over the years as the fees actually were ratcheted up. And just a little bit more in terms of the consumerism, then I have suggested elsewhere that as students become consumers, and that they're really calling the shots in terms of what is offered to them, the nature of courses. They want to play a greater role in that regard, and we see, well, a contraction in terms of the nature of the knowledge, less critical knowledge, less theory, and so on. But I'm not focusing particularly on that today, but it is a sort of dimension of this. And then globalization, well, we're talking about something that's not peculiar to one nation state, but has occurred throughout the world. So it has spread like wildfire. So, as I said, Canada, in some respects, was perhaps has been a little bit slower to follow this path, but maybe things are changing now. But we'll see. And the fact that it's a global phenomenon means that it's much more difficult to resist to change, because what is occurring in one nation state is then emulated in another. So vice chancellors send emissaries from one, from their university to others to acquire information about how to do it. So they have a handbook, and you find extraordinary similarities then in the practices that emerge within institutions at the state level and at the institutional level. So the corporatization of universities, then, what I mean by this, I think basically one can think of the application of business practices to universities. So universities become, they are corporations, and going back to the Middle Ages, of course, the idea of a corporation is something that has no end and is formed for some good purpose. It's a rather different type of corporatization that we're looking at. As they become business entities, they're interested in making profits, just like other business corporations. So we see phrases like the enterprise university, academic capitalism have been used to apply to universities. So the focus is on productivity and performativity. So academics have to perform and be seen to perform and to promote the self. So this is part of the modus operandi of the corporatized university. I'll say a little bit more about that in the context of merit. In terms of research, of course, which is now assumed a crucial position, knowledge transfer is crucial. So it's not enough simply to do the research. That research must have use value in the market. So using that sort of Marxian phrase there. So one must be able to commercialize the results of the research. And so, it's particular types of research, technoscience, for example, that are valued most highly. Universities hope that there will be a cure for cancer, secured within the university or something like that can be commercialized and will bring billions of dollars as well as great renown to the institution. So that's an important part of it. And so it means that in terms of the performativity of the individual academic, that academic must be an entrepreneur. So to secure grants, bring in money themselves, and to effect some sort of knowledge transfer in commercialising research, or for it to have some other value in the market. So I'm borrowing this term, the technopreneur, is the ideal academic as a technopreneur. It's a slightly cumbersome word, but this is a word that was then a neologism that was devised by Jane Kenway, who defines it as combining techno-scientific knowledge with business acumen. So these are the values that are most highly regarded on the part of the ideal academic, and preferably someone who'll be an international star in the global higher education firmament. So the academic criteria, of course, that are very familiar from the past were teaching, research and service, three-pronged. Now there's a fourth. So enterprise has been included, and it's formally included you find on many university websites. So the University of Edinburgh, for example, includes enterprise, so well-established and old universities include enterprise as being a sort of crucial criterion and having the same status as teaching, research. Service was never quite the same level as teaching and research, but enterprise has been included. So it's endorsing these ideas that all academics have to be performative and productive. And to ensure that, we find auditing regimes. And this is where I think Canada is perhaps not quite in the same position as Australia and the UK, New Zealand and many other countries in having a state-based bureaucracy devoted then to the whole business of auditing, to ensure that institutions and academics then perform. So there is this necessity for accountability and transparency. And it sort of grew out of the NPM, or New Public Management, from the US and the UK, spread elsewhere. And part of that are the league tables, which have taken off to an extraordinary degree, I think, this century. So the ranking of institutions and the desperate desire for each institution to sort of raise itself in the rankings. So if Harvard University is number one, right, what are the criteria associated with the excellence? And every other institution in the world is endeavouring to emulate those criteria, even though they may not have, billions of dollars in endowments. But so these rankings have taken hold in an extraordinary way, even though deans and others say, well, of course we don't believe in this, the methodology's flawed. How can you compare apples and oranges? We believe in diversity. We're a little bit different. But of course, then they say, but at the same time, we're 2 positions higher than we were last year. And, and if we work really hard, we can go up, and be in the top 50 or the top 100 or the top 500 or whatever. So the rankings then are important in terms of calculability and what has been recently referred to as the metricization of the academy. Excuse me. So everything has to be counted and measured in some way. And of course, the sting in the tail is that financial rewards will attach then to the ranking. And and of course punishment if one doesn't perform as well as is hoped. And so while there is a state bureaucracy, universities then are beholden to those requirements because they know that they will lose money otherwise. So one is, implicated and forced to accept that model. And of course, within the university itself, through line managers and individuals themselves, of course, individual academics internalize this notion, these notions of ranking and reward, and there may be punishment, discipline, and maybe even dismissal if one hasn't satisfied the requisite publication and grants requirement for a particular level. So it's a really sort of vicious system and a complete change from the way things operate in a much more laissez-faire approach in the past. Now, I'm contrasting then the ideal academic with the less than ideal academic. Now, the ideal worker, the ideal, someone Joan Williams described as being immune from family responsibilities. And of course, traditionally, this was a sort of male figure as head of the household who had a female partner at home who looked after the children and was a full-time homemaker. Now, we've moved then from this traditional family model to the neo-traditional family model, so that where we still have the male partner who's engaged in full-time work, and the female partner in heterosexual relationship would work part-time. So she should be there to take the children to school and to pick them up at the end of the day. But in between, she should be a productive worker for the state. So this satisfies the requirement. And so we find this move to casual and part-time work, which of course is overwhelmingly feminized, as we know that, at least 75%, which suits very much this new academic labour market. It suits other forms of capitalism as well, but the academic labour market is peculiarly suited. And I can give you the Australian figure because it's very, very high, that we now find that 60% of academic workers in Australia are casual or part-time, so precarious workers. I mean, that's a really dramatic change from full-time employment. I'm sorry, I don't have the Canadian figure at my fingertips, but someone might actually know what that is. I mean, it is actually difficult to find these figures because often they're hidden, but the Australian researcher who did this went through superannuation data, so it's fairly reliable. And so we find that women as the sort of ideal precarious workers, the traditional family model, become a sort of teaching and academic subclass, so that they move in, do their teaching for a semester or a session, or run some tutorials, and then they disappear. So they don't participate in the collegial life of the institution. So it suits, because they don't cause any trouble then. And we might find them also playing a similar role on research projects, just for the life of a project, as research assistants and support workers and so on. So there's this huge feminized academic subclass. So I'm suggesting, it's the creation of the less than ideal academic, but this sort of ideal subordinate worker. So we see, I think, as a result of academic capitalism within corporatized university, a widening of the gap between research and teaching. So research then we see as part of the productive economy, So producing, as I said, the research, the academic capitalism, bringing in the grants. So there's more time to do that, more money associated with it, and more prestige. So despite the fact that positions are usually advertised in terms of teaching, it's the research now that occupies the privileged position. So the bigger the grant, the better it is, even if the person says, I don't really quite know what to do with this money. There is that pressure to bring in money. And at the global level, to be an international star, to move around and win prizes, preferably a Nobel Prize, is highly desirable. And so we see that, elevation of research, which didn't occur in the past, where universities, of course, in the according to the Newman model, were concerned with teaching, and then, in the 20th century, it was research and teaching, and in the 21st century, the focus really is on research, even though, of course, teaching sustains the research economy. And the teaching then, contrasting it with the productive economy of research, we see as a sort of reproductive economy, a gift then, less time and status, casualised and undervalued. And we see that particularly, I suggest, in humanities and social sciences. We see these values reflected with the large classes, feminised areas, and the research being undervalued in the market compared with technoscience. So while there, of course, there's research occurring in humanities and social sciences, it's not valued in the same way as it is in technoscience, because the market doesn't value those things anymore, doesn't value theory and critique. And we hear about humanities and social sciences departments being closed down all the time or truncated in some way. So some have referred to this new environment that we occupy as a post-academic culture. I don't know what you think about that. We might have some discussion about whether you think we do actually occupy a post-academic culture. Some say universities are dead. We can't talk about universities anymore because they have been transmogrified. So we still talk about merit as being the sole criterion for appointment, and we see the legitimacy of entrepreneurialism now being adduced, and applicants being asked about their grants and what sort of grants that they're going to secure, what sort of money, and if one is the director of a centre bringing in money, that's highly valued by the entrepreneurial university. Well, what about equity that we used to hear about once but don't hear much about anymore? Well, I suggest it's totally incompatible with academic capitalism, so we don't really hear about it. There's no tickable box for it when one is filling out these forms, so it doesn't appear in league tables. So that's not seen to be a valuable thing. And in terms of the rankings of universities, we're good at equity. Well, no one seems to care about that. It's because it's not something that's valued within the market. So I'm suggesting then we see a masculinist construction of the technopreneur, this superstar with business acumen, just as we've seen business men in the past, traveling the world, moving from site to site, maximizing their profits, taking risks, and risk is an important dimension of the entrepreneurial university, but it's seen to be very much a sort of masculinist idea. It's not that women aren't doing this, of course, but this is the model, and we do see a disproportionality there in terms of gender. So this technopreneur has no time for work-life balance, as engages in work. And usually there's a supportive family, the partner at home, and support staff. So notice the language that's used everywhere, supporting usually his research, teaching, admin, and so on. So in terms of research, what is seen to be valuable then is securing fellowships in which there'll be amount of money for someone else to be able to do the teaching. So that is contracted out. So it goes to one of these precarious workers. And so that the technopreneur can concentrate on his research, which is held in higher regard. And so even though there's a lot of rhetoric about excellence in teaching and so on that we hear today, it still sort of pulls into insignificance compared with the research. So coming to conclusion, I'm suggesting then that the ideal academic today is a technopreneur, which is a masculinized construction, and in contrast with the less than ideal academic, typically a casual employee, a feminized position. I'm not saying it's a totally rigid line, but I'm saying we can see some evidence of that. And this new configuration then is secured by a notion of managerialism, which again is masculinized, ensures the new order. So we see, these bureaucratized bodies at the state level, and then within the university we see a president supported by what's now called the senior executive. So, I think it's interesting to see the way the language of business has been then emulated by universities. And they're paid huge salaries. I mean, in my own institution, it's about 10 times what ordinary academics receive. So you have this elite, this new elite above the professoriate. And they are managers. And their role is to tell academics what to do and how to do it. And to tell them, to rectify things if they haven't done it properly. And we see, the way this line of managerialism is secured through deans, heads of school, directors, etc. If you don't do such and such, if you're not compliant, you will be punished. You will get less money. So it's very effective. And it's supported overall by a state higher education bureaucracy, which has become more intrusive, and in fact to quite an extraordinary degree, but I'm talking a bit more about that when I go to Edmonton on Friday. I won't pursue that. So then finally we see academic capitalism has neatly dealt with the fear of feminization of the academy. And we find that the gendered binary, that of course has always existed to some extent, but its hope would come to an end, has been instantiated. Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to speak in Margaret's wake, in the wake of Margaret's speech. The title of the talk I actually read and responding to was the Mirage of Merit, which is not a huge shift. I've been trying to decide ever since you began speaking whether mirage or mystique is my favorite term, but I refer to mirage, and this one I've tried to change it in most places. I think it's a really interesting idea. It's really challenging to comment on Margaret's paper for the perhaps unusual reason that I agree with almost everything she says. So the standard, if perhaps outworn, philosopher's strategy of parry and thrust with the aim of demolishing one's opponent can't be my approach. Given the dire picture Margaret paints, I really wish it could. Nor am I well versed in legal theory, even though I claim to agree with her. And because I'm not really versed in legal theory, I don't know whereof I speak. And that's a very strange position for a self-professed epistemologist to occupy, but that's how it is. But there are sufficient points of overlap with academic institutional issues in law and philosophy and other disciplines in the humanities and social sciences for striking affinities to be apparent, even though there are no very obvious ways, I think, to counter Margaret's counsel of despair with a counsel of hope. But there's a certain heuristic strength in naming the issues now. For those of you who are feminists in the audience will catch the reference. There's certain heuristic strength in naming the issues now, just 50 years after Betty Friedan began to change the world by naming the problem that hitherto had no name. And indeed, Margaret Thornton has produced a wonderfully astute analysis of the current state of gender divisions in the legal and the academic world as she finds it, focusing on what she so aptly refers to as the mystique, or the mirage of merit. In what follows, I'm going to engage briefly with her analysis from the point of view of the beleaguered situation of the humanities and social sciences more generally in the English-speaking world in Canada, with the hope at least that there's strength to be gained from recognition of mutuality, solidarity, and perhaps also some inspiration about where to go from there. The absence of Margaret Thornton's reference to the mystique or the mirage recalls certain debates about hiring policy more than a decade ago here at York, where affirmative action with respect to gender and other so-called minority identities was an active issue, and excellence was one of the principal attributes specified for a potential hire, an attribute believed to encompass all the rest. Members of one department remarked, as though in passing, that at least we all knew what excellence meant, intending then simply to move on to evaluating candidates, slotting them into that category or not. But it wasn't so simple, for this, it seemed, was the very issue. We did not, and I think still do not know what excellence means, except perhaps as a character summary of that very person whom, in the other version of the paper that I read, is the hero or the villain whom she dubs benchmark man. And I like that phrase, so can I claim it back from the previous version? Things are better than these comments suggest, at least in many departments at York and elsewhere, where care is usually taken to be clear about faculty expectations and fair in assessing potential applicants. But in the wide world of philosophy, which is the world I know best, and in academic hiring in North America and more generally, it's hard to judge how much of a real, deeply effective conceptual shift has taken place, away from outworn categories of excellence, as tacitly embodied as much in white heterosexual maleness as in certain areas of credentialed inquiry, and toward opening out into newer, more creative ways of deliberating and judging, especially in view of an increasing, if too often suppressed, awareness of changing demographics, and concomitantly of changing conceptions of worthiness, as much as it pertains to certain subject matters, as to certain human kinds, to subjectivities, to people. And here especially, I think, a far-reaching conceptual shift is required. And of course, we philosophers deal in concepts, although we try to bring them back down into the world when we can. I think what Margaret, in the longer version of the paper, called an atavistic fear of the feminization of the academy, I think what it refers to is partly a deep fear about prospects of having to navigate a range of unfamiliar ideas, outrageous questions, issues, and new styles of reasoning that disrupt and unsettle what amount to absolute presuppositions that have hitherto long governed the academic life. Presuppositions about the ideal academic that she rightly notes are now threatening to reaffirm a certain hegemony. And I think this thought pertains as much to deep-seated assumptions about what kind of person a worthy academic must be, as to what projects of inquiry, what thoughts, questions, and ideas are worthy to occupy physical and intellectual space in the academy across a range of disciplines and subdisciplines. There is, in fact, a deep security in homogeneity and timidity, whose history Margaret aptly refers to, or at least did in the written version, must surely figure into various forms of resistance to potential innovation and reconstitution projects at this rather tenuous juncture in the history of the academy, loosely aggregated. fear of innovation that responds to ways of being in the world that differ from the hitherto taken for granted males. Sorry, that's not a bad slip actually, but the hitherto taken for granted ways of what again was called in the original paper benchmark man. Ways that require openness, that standard typologies of research and practice rarely allow. What I want to call the embodied specificities of people who differ from this benchmark man were once declared irrelevant in principle, if not always in practice, to processes of judging that elusive quality I've mentioned, academic excellence. Yet at the same time, some of those very specificities were tacitly or not so tacitly effective in practices of sorting the putatively deserving from the undeserving, and not always even-handedly. Often beneath the surface, those differences were definitive of the deliberations and exclusions that sustained a demographically monolithic, monochromatic academic community, quite apart from variations across disciplines. Their current troubling, if somewhat tacit, reaffirmation informs much of Margaret Thornton's astute analysis. Such specificities manifest in external concerns about the public face of the university, interwoven with internal convictions about which matters are worthy of academic inquiry, which projects are deserving of grants, worthy of publication, cause for recognition and esteem, and in certain areas of research about how their absence, or their tentative attempts to establish a presence, works to affirm the monolithic status of another mythological creature, the man of reason. And here I'm borrowing a phrase from Margaret's compatriot Genevieve Lloyd in the title of her book, The Man of Reason. Anecdotally, I'm thinking about the eminent British ethicist Philippa Foot, who in the late 1960s was invited to deliver a paper at a US university. Note that it was the late 1960s. In response to a request for her title, she sent an illegibly scribbled note. Evidently, faculty members consulted up and down the corridors trying to decipher it, saying to one another that it seemed she must be going to talk about abortion, but surely that could not be so. And it was. And I'm mentioning this incident not just for itself, but to suggest that indeed there have been changes, even in a subject so hitherto austere as philosophy, concomitant with wider social changes, at least to the extent that topics once beyond mention in the elevated conversations of philosophers have, in their acceptance into the discipline, changed the landscape of inquiry well beyond what the substance of that one paper on abortion suggests. But the change is tenuous and unstable. Recent closings of women's and gender studies programs, ongoing reminders to job candidates, at least in philosophy and very likely elsewhere, that it is best not to list feminist philosophy as an area of specialization. Small numbers of women on conference programs, on faculty lists in full-time tenured positions, attest to an ongoing need for vigilance, and yet also for advocacy. Despite the bad press advocacy tends to attract. Issues internal to the disciplines, issues connected with what Margaret calls numerosity in evaluations of merit, also test continued pressures to venerate this heroic man and his presumptively autonomous, self-sufficient aspects. Of many possible examples, I'm thinking now of an ongoing disdain for collaborative inquiry, with the complexities it produces for evaluations of merit. I'm thinking also of the research evaluation exercises Margaret has mentioned, the REF, that haunt the lives of academics in the UK. And by way of example, by way of illustration, and this is a small example, but I think it has larger implications, I'm thinking of the exclusions with respect to this research evaluation exercise, the exclusions of book reviews from items that count as figurable, calculable evidence of productivity. These latter, although I think they're exceptionally important in the humanities, are perhaps less easy to characterize until one pauses to think that books that fall into limbo for want of having been reviewed are less apt to garner scholarly recognition of the sort that academics, both new and old, require, not just for purposes related to numerosity, but also for confirmation and inclusion in a productive academic community. These aspects of academic life are not so straightforwardly calculable in their effects in maintaining an outworn status quo, but their contribution to a climate of collegial vulnerability cannot be gainsaid. Hence, although in many disciplines book reviews no longer count as contributions to scholarly achievement, their exclusion devalues both the book itself and the scholarly work that goes into producing a thoughtful review. Moreover, devaluing book reviews as a form of academic productivity, together with not solitary forms of academic activity, damages any tacit sight of universities as communities of inquiry, while revalidating a spirit of individual competitiveness. Although how some of these exclusions reinforce the stature of benchmark man is more oblique than other examples I've adduced, I think their contribution to a solitary and stark individualism is part of this larger picture. Now, what does it all amount to? Clearly, the point can't be to work for displacing benchmark man, only to replace him with an equivalently monolithic alternative figure. Rather, as Margaret Thornton's paper invites us to do, the project has to be to deconstruct the very thought of a monolithic ideal, and thence to work toward aspirations that better reflect the demographic multiplicity and scholarly diversity of the early 21st century academy and wider world. Of course, the thought is not so simple in its potential for realization, because the timidity I've also mentioned, Margaret has referred to, generates precisely what I want to call the kind of pullback into an older and more comfortable for some stasis that the so-called new social movements of the 1960s and after promised to dislodge, and that neoliberalism is now working to affirm. Now, that pullback can't be straightforwardly condemned in an era of increasing insecurity in the academy, where whole programs and subdisciplines can be closed down with rationales justified by appeal to numerosity. But the process is in no sense ameliorative and needs to be acknowledged for what it is. Thinking then about, and this is my last largish point, thinking about the implausibility of imagining simply displacing the monolithic masculine ideal Margaret has diagnosed with the new, less restrictive and coercive one, recalls Genevieve Lloyd's response, to whom I mentioned earlier, in the mid-1980s, to participants in many discussions of her then new book, The Man of Reason. There she documents the implicit or frequently explicit maleness of ideals of reason, as with culturally specific variations, they inform Western philosophical and cultural discourse from the ancient Greeks through to the late 20th century. When she was challenged at the time to propose an alternative to the man and the maleness of reason, she remarked that it had taken so long and so much careful analysis to deconstruct the ideals of reason and to expose its 2,000-plus-year-old tacit or overt associations with maleness and the exclusions of the feminine. She commented that it would be facile, careless to imagine that a new conceptual apparatus could, without further ado, be inserted ready-made in its place. Although it may seem something of a stretch, I want, in concluding then, to suggest that this thought has distant echoes with some readings of Audre Lorde's caution against using the master's tools to dismantle or rebuild the master's house. A caution I'm reading as a revolutionary declaration, and not, as many of her detractors have claimed, as a reactionary or shut-down ploy. On the reading I find plausible, Lorde is insisting that she does not want us, whoever we are, to cower in fear of the master, but to stand up and disrupt the false consciousness that constrains us. Hence she wrote, and I'm quoting, "Survival is not an academic skill. It is learning how to take our differences and make them strengths. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They will allow us temporarily to beat him at his own games, but they'll never enable us to bring about genuine change. And this fact is only threatening to those women who still define the master's house as their only source of support." End of quote. So Lorde recognized that feminists in the 1970s, late 1970s, had not succeeded in countering the separations and schisms within the movement, which only perpetuated the dominance of patriarchy. So in arguing that the master's tools will never displace the master's house, she's insisting that only if feminists learn how to take our differences and make them strengths, will equality be achieved? I'm not sure equality is necessarily the goal, but within that frame of reference, the conundrum is, of course, that the practices and processes that that accord benchmark man, or the man of reason, the definitive voice, are going to persist. And those of us who oppose them cannot just stand outside the house in the rain, waiting for new ways of building, doing, and being to evolve. So the challenge Margaret has presented, I think, requires renewed efforts from feminists, both female and male, to recover and rethink the early promise of feminist thought, to bring about far-reaching conceptual change. From Margaret's astute analysis, it's also apparent that the forms such reenacting can take are still to be determined, given how insistently that benchmark man is currently being reactivated and reanimated. These are deliberations, in my reading, that Margaret's excellent paper urges us to undertake. They require arduous, ongoing effort, just when some of us might have been tempted to sit back and believe the issues had been resolved. But I think this is the rallying cry Margaret's analysis has sounded. So thank you.
So we have quite a bit of time, I think, for questions.
I think I forgot to give you this.
Play the talk show host, and you can direct your questions to one or both of the speakers. I'll try to keep a list, but since I don't know anybody's many people's names, I may.
Hi, my name is Sass. I'm a first-year PhD graduate student here at Osgoode Hall Law School.
Can't hear you even from right near you.
Okay, I will speak up. I'm trying not to overwhelm the microphone. My question, I guess, I'm a man who has a hammer and sees everything as a nail. So I approach your talk from the perspective of tax law, which is where I research, and I've always thought that the universities have turned, the funding for universities have turned into unofficial tax expenditures for business. Universities are expected now to train the workers for the workforce, and now slowly research is supposed to be the R&D departments for business. And I'm just wondering how far this can go, and my concern to tie in with your talk today is some universities, both well-known universities and newly developed universities, are starting to offer courses where the instruction is recorded. They take the best in the field, record the talks that are relevant to that subject area, or they seem to be relevant to that subject area, and now you no longer need an instructor, even the precarious worker, to provide that instruction anymore. I'm just wondering whether you have considered how that may play out going forward.
Yes, I have considered that, and I did make a facetious comment about a decade ago that we might need only one lecturer, say, in tort law, preferably from an Ivy League institution, who would be able to, deliver their lectures to the whole world. Well, that's actually becoming a reality now. It wasn't a reality then, but with MOOCs and so on. And indeed, my own Vice-Chancellor would like us to do that, because it would free up academics to engage in research. So again, privileging that idea of research over teaching, and that anyone can do teaching, or it can be minimised in some way. And your other point about the idea of the university as an adjunct to business, I mean, that's certainly the case. That universities are supposed to produce practice-ready graduates or work-ready graduates in some way. In law, they talk about practice-ready. So the graduate's supposed to be able to move seamlessly from the university into, a global law firm or something, and be able to perform appropriately without any more training, which means that more and more training, rather than education, becomes the role of the university. Did you want to?
I just want to say one tiny thing in response to this, because philosophy is a little bit strange with regard to some of these thoughts. It's obviously quite old-fashioned, but I think it shouldn't be old-fashioned and outmoded. My view is that a lot of learning takes place interactively in good teaching situations with good students. And I think that it would be a different kind of learning and a different kind of knowledgeable student who would emerge. He or she might be much more industry ready. And thoughtfulness, certainly in the Canadian political situation right now, is not highly valued. But I would find it very sad to think of that happening. On the other hand, if a prime minister can say that history should no longer be taught in the schools, it's not going to be very long before someone might say philosophy should never be taught anywhere except what people want to read in their studies or listen to on a recorded thing. So it's a difficult issue. And that's not about law, actually.
Hi, I'm Dana Scott. I'm a member of the faculty here. I have.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay. I want to know, Margaret, if you have any, and Lorraine, if you have any ideas about how we can resist this model from within the institution, right? So one of the things that I struggle with is this tension between, you know, how we protect our young feminist colleagues and how we kind of promote them, right? So I feel it really hard. I find it hard to think about, you know, whether or not, say, certain positions of power within the academic administration, whether those are primarily a burden to those colleagues or whether they have some benefits, right? And you find yourself, you're in this tension, right? You want to sort of protect them and their work-life balance and all of that, but at the same time, you know they're left out in the rain, right, if they don't go to those places. So any advice for how we can navigate that one is welcome.
Well, unfortunately, I don't have a simple blueprint. I think, as Lorraine mentioned in terms of Genevieve Lloyd's response, one can't come up with an instantaneous response about, you know, the way forward. I think that neoliberalism has such a hold at the moment. It's very hard to see a way out of that. Now, of course, things do change, but I would think it would take years and years, decades, for real change. But of course, you know, within your own department, I think it's always possible to do something to stand up. But, you know, I think institutions in some cases have ensured that that doesn't happen. Mm-hmm. And I know a number of institutions in Australia actually enacted what they called codes of conduct, which meant that individuals were not permitted to speak publicly about their institution or to say anything that was vaguely critical, and they could be disciplined and in some way for that. So that they're, you know, it is very hard. And when I was conducting interviews for Privatising the Public University, individuals all over the world said to me, well, you know, this is the way it is. You know, we have to accept it. They saw it as too big and too difficult for an individual to be able to do something. So it was easier to go with the flow. So, I mean, one can always do small things, you know, and I mean, I know about, you know, the argument in terms of the spaces and in able to do that with your own students. But I think the overall picture is a bleak one. I can't present an optimistic message about the way forward on that. Did you want to?
I don't think I have anything to add. I think it's just very sad. I'm trying to think when it was worse and when it was better. I come from an academic family, and when I first was on the itinerant job market, which I was on for 9 years, and those weren't particularly happy years, I was in various institutions where the infighting in the faculty was absolutely appalling. And I said then, with complete naivety to my father, who was then retired from having taught at an institution, you know, I said, I don't remember this from when you were first teaching. It seemed to me that it was a really happy collegial environment. And I didn't even understand his comment until I thought about it for a while. But he said, well, of course, we chose the people we wanted to work with. And there were no processes. So I think sometimes when I think, how could it be worse? It's that old boys club worseness that I think of as worse. But I'm not sure how much further ahead we have. I mean, I think we moved far ahead and then back. And the back is really quite hard to imagine. I was fortunate to finish my wanderings on the market when we were still moving ahead.
Hi, my name is Julia Janes. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Social Work, and my area of inquiry is community-engaged research. So I'd like both Lorraine and perhaps Margaret to comment on something I'm trying to think through, and that is sort of the collision of the neoliberal turn with this paradigm of inclusive liberalism and the partnering paradigm, and how the instrumentalities engaged in community-engaged scholarship and all the other ways that we talk about collaborative knowledge work actually can resist but also reproduce the neoliberal term. So how these two suture onto each other.
So in talking about partnerships, you're talking about what I know as industry partnerships.
Yes,
so
I'm
affecting
talking about the partnership paradigm in terms of community.
Yes, so industry is interpreted broadly. But in terms of grants and things like that, I mean, yes, I mean, I can see that there is can be a positive dimension there, but I mean, it is fraught in terms of research. You know, these particular partnership grants or linkage grants or whatever they might be called often have a sting in the tail that you're supposed to satisfy the partner. If they're giving the money, you're supposed to say things that they want to hear as a result of the research, which is, you know, a worrying thing. And I do know of instances where individuals have not been paid because their client partner didn't like the nature of the research, including a state government in one case, which led to the collapse of a centre. So that's a very, you know, a sort of very negative dimension. But on the other hand, I mean, people have had positive experiences about that. I'm a little bit concerned because it constrains the notion of academic freedom in terms of the research. You know, if you feel that you have to produce, you know, findings that are going to be approved. But I don't know whether you want to.
No, I don't really have anything to say about that, because for all my earnest plea for collaborative research, which I do in principle value very highly, philosophy tends to be a very solitary, in one's own study discipline, apart from conferences, of course. So I have no experience with philosophers partnering with anybody but themselves. And that may be an indictment of the discipline or not.
Okay, could I just follow up very briefly with what Margaret spoke about? And it's interesting because it's an absolute flip of my area of inquiry, where we're working with communities that are very vulnerable and marginalized, and the power clearly rests with the academy. So it's interesting to think of the partnering paradigm in the way that you framed it, which is something that, especially in social work, we seem loath to do, to think of the partnering paradigm as the partner, the public partner having power, as opposed to the community partner who has considerably less power in these negotiations, and it can be very instrumental on the part of the academic.
Right.
Thank you.
I think that was a comment. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was incredibly bleak in the best possible way. I just spent the weekend at a lengthy meeting for a gigantic collaborative grant. I have lots of thoughts on this matter of how collaboration dovetails very neatly, even however marginalized the partners you have with neoliberal stuff, but I won't go into that right now. And last night I had to spend all evening at a quite tedious diplomatic event representing the center, of which I'm a director, et cetera. During all this, my children had various crises at which I was not present, et cetera, et cetera. So as I listened to your talk, what I was thinking about, this figure of the less than ideal academic, and here I am, you know, my emotionally failing to be benchmark man, even as I'm desperately trying to perform being benchmark man here all the time. I kept thinking about the good enough mother as the kind of flip to the less than ideal academic, and the sort of disappearance of the idea that you could be a good enough mother both in the world of academia and in the external world. And it seems to me that the sort of flip side of benchmark man is this like insane hyper benchmark mother on the outside who is rigorously attending to all her children's needs and has to go to fundraising stuff at the school, all of this kind of stuff. I'm not sure I have a question, but I wonder if being a good enough academic might be what one should aspire to or something. Why do we have to be excellent all the time? And so impossible. And it just seems like good enoughness might be a really valuable criterion for thinking about a more open way of being in the world and resuscitating that kind of set of arguments about how to be in the world seems like a kind of valuable counterweight to the kinds of things you're describing. So anyways, it's not really a question, it's more of a comment, but I feel what you're saying very deeply.
Well, certainly one of the things I'm interested in is work-life balance, and I'm actually have a project a grant I'm supposed to be working on that, and how it is that one can actually perform a job which never comes to an end. In terms of academia, the monkey's always on the back, as one of my interviewees actually said. You think about what you're supposed to be doing all the time, and so there isn't space in this hyper-competitive environment for a balanced life. So I am actually very interested in that, but I don't have the answers as to how to do it. But maybe what you're saying is to just most people just do it anyway, or they make do because they have to, because of the various strands of their life.
Yeah, maybe that has to be our ethic, as opposed to excellence as our kind of ethical practice. Maybe good enoughness could be a very good ethical practice.
Well, of course, vice-chancellors and deans will disapprove when you say, so that you have to demonstrate excellence, which Lorraine mentioned, and certainly there's some very nice work. Bill Redding's work on, deconstructing that idea of excellence and how everything has to be excellent. He says, even the parking has to be excellent. And, so, how the universities make these absurd demands on people. So that is the standard. And the bar keeps raising, being raised rather, so that one can never really sort of hurdle it. So, to do what one does and to feel confident, I suppose, in that. Yeah.
I do think there's another side to that too, because the way you were talking, it suggested that in our societies, it principally is women who have to do the work-life balance. But it seems to me a real conceptual shift would come about if it were as important in heterosexual or same-sex relationships for all participants in the relationship to realize that work-life balance is crucial, and it can't be just one who has to be running like crazy to achieve it.
My name is Courtney, and I'm a student of Carlotta's, and actually had a follow-up question to that, and I was going to ask it anyway, and just some, I guess, comment but also question. I'm a first-year PhD student and a mother of a 4 and an almost 8-year-old, and actually, this is somewhat easier than working out of the house full-time. Weirdly, they just never stop complaining that they already don't see me. So I completely understand what she's talking about, and I know that this is a big issue in academia. There was a book that I read when I first had my first, called Opting Out by Pamela Stone in the States, and she talked about she had done a very big study across, it was white middle-class women in the States, and it was something like, what she ended up finding out amongst a bunch of other things was that only 10%, I think it was, of female academics with children were in tenure track positions. I don't know what the numbers are in Canada or in Australia. My guess is it's probably not that different. And I just wonder if you think, you were talking, I think, Lorraine, that you were talking about having to revive some of the, maybe it was the activism or advocacy or whatever from the 70s. But I wonder if tenure track academia, based on what you've said, and I completely agree with everything you said, is just fundamentally incompatible with that. This professor, I'm sorry, I don't know her name, was talking about wanting to protect people with work-life balance. I think that that's a fundamental shift in the way women, especially older women who are, like, we're having children once we have our careers. I was a journalist and had my children while I was already in there. But we're having children later once we've got careers established, and yet we want the work-life balance, and we're portrayed as selfishly wanting it all, as opposed to seeing the shift that might have sent feminist advocacy off the rails, perhaps, in the in this kind of the academic environment. And I just want to know what you think about that.
That's you.
Is that me?
Yeah.
What?
She mentioned your name.
Oh.
I quoted you a lot in my master's research. I love your stuff.
That puts the pressure on, doesn't it? Well, I mean, all I can say is personally I struggle with work-life balance because I started my master's when I had 3 preschool children and eventually finished it. I don't think things are much easier or much better for women of your generation than they were for women of mine. Maybe a little bit because it's not so unusual. You probably don't have your mother saying things to you like, how can you expect your husband to put up with that sort of thing? Some of us have had that. And I suppose...
But the husband is still earning a lot more money, and so you have a harder time asking him, even if he's fantastic.
And initially when you get something like a fellowship to start your master's or your PhD and you think, wow, this is fantastic, and somebody suggests that it must be for pocket money or pin money is the word, isn't it? That must be your pin money. And you say, well, for any man who's getting a shirk or a Canada Research Fellowship or whatever they are, this is his money. This is what he's living on. This is his salary, and you have to make it work. So I don't know how to do work-life balance very well. I mean, I've tried to do it all my life, and I guess I'm still alive, and so are my children. And some of them have children, and one of them is doing work-life balance as a corporate lawyer in a pretty good way. But I don't know that they learned from my example. My example was fairly anguished most of the time.
But it's fundamentally incompatible then with what you think about the expectations of the ideal academic?
Not if you're good enough. Not if you're good enough. That's the problem. But the good enough is a really moving target. No, it's.
I don't mean that to sound I really wonder if it is. And I mean, we're seeing the signs that so many women with children, the majority of women with children do not end up and are the casualized force there. What is that telling us? Are we denying something that's in front of us?
So I have 3 other questions on the list, and this is called till 2:50. So I do find this part of the discussion fascinating, but I just wanted to move on just to get people's comments. Yeah. Did you have any? No, but I've got one. Okay. I'm just checking to make sure I have. Yes, I did. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. My name is Prabjot Sidhu, and my name is Prabjot Sidhu, and
we can't hear you.
You still okay?
This is not
for that.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I just finished law school from University of Ottawa last year, so I'm very new into everything. So even just hearing some of the dialogue is already kind of scaring me a bit. It feels like I have a really, really long way to go. But I really appreciated your remarks on the equity agendas and how they're not valued in the market. So what does that mean? What does that mean for, say, not just I'm saying personally myself, but I'm saying, say, someone like myself, is 26 years old, finished law school, is on her way to do her thing, and now, it's I'm not going to look the same as everybody in a firm or a faculty or whatever it is. So, and I'm not just speaking in terms of racialized minorities, but persons with disabilities and whatnot. So, if an equity agenda is not marketable, in Canada we value so much on multiculturalism and being in a mosaic. How I mean, how do you wrap your head around something like that? What are some tools or ways to kind of not downplay who you are or what you have to offer as a result of who you are, which is the diversity you bring to the table, and at the same time be marketable, it's just, yeah.
Do you want to talk about
that's yours.
Well, I don't know. I'm being presenting a critique of Margaretization, but I mean, I know that this is part of it. You know what you're saying of having to present oneself in a particular way. It's part of that sort of performativity. You know, you've got to show that you're performing. You've got to present yourself in a particular way, wear particular clothes, and I was just hearing something on the television the other day about, yes, well, I was able to make it, and this was a wonderful experience, and then, and so on. So actually sort of bringing all that into it. So I'm a bit sceptical of some of that talk, but I mean, I'd prefer that you just, be yourself rather than think that you've got to, have this, expanded notion of self. And I do think we see that more in job applications as well. And, maybe someone, Mary Jane or others, might want to actually comment on that. And so people sort of giving an exaggerated sense of, of their achievements. I mean, I don't think that that's really the way to go. But I think the environment does actually encourage that. So, yes.
This is actually not directly aimed at your question, although it's about some of the questions that have been raised. But one of the sad shifts I think has taken place in Canada recently is that at the time I was coming off the itinerant job market, there was a governmental awareness that that a whole generation, in fact, of academics with PhDs were falling through the cracks in various places. And it included, in fact, at least 10 of these materialized at York. The Government of Canada developed a scheme of what they called Canada Research Fellowships, for which people who had been on the itinerant job market for a long time and had not been able to find anything, or when people had been producing and only in occasional part-time teaching, could be sponsored by a university to hold one of these Canada Research Fellowships. And that did rescue a whole lot of people who were falling through the cracks. Now, the pertinence to that now seems to me that I think times are at least nearly as dire. And I think one of the hopes could be that some kind of initiative could be inspired. Who would inspire it, since everybody's desperately tired of trying to inspire such things? But it seemed to me that kind of rescue operation really saved, certainly 10 of us came to York on that scheme, and many people, and all of us I think are still here, and many other people at the University of Western Ontario, which supported them very strongly. U of T supported them very strongly. I don't know how else it worked across the province, but somehow if someone young and energetic had the initiative to stimulate one of those sorts of things again, one of those sorts of movements, in recognition of how the Academy is suffering from the loss of really good people who are on these revolving door things that Margaret's talked about. That's really perhaps pie in the sky. It is something that worked once, and I think the time was fairly bad then, but not as bad as it is now. And that's really not worth anything as a recommendation, but it's something people need to be thinking about.
Thank you, Margaret and Lorraine, for coming today and speaking. My name is Jordan Poole, and I'm a first-year Masters of Education student. And I kind of wanted to pose a question that goes a little bit of a different gear, but same kind of thing with job markets and stuff. But speaking about the corporatization of universities, I'm wondering if the massification of students coming in through universities is going to result long-term in the commodification of degrees themselves. So just to expand a little bit, from my provincial understanding and from a student point of view, a lot more students are being encouraged to and pushed through university. So resulting in bachelor degrees sort of being common or everyone holding one. And for someone like myself who wants to be a teacher in Ontario, the movement is to get a Master's of Education, try to diversify and try to add another merit, I would say, for me in the workplace. so I know that Masters of Education programs are growing as well. So I'm wondering if long-term, if PhDs then are going to be associated more with a price tag than with merit, and is that going to add a layer of complexity of how we establish merit and excellence and so on?
I think that's already happening to some extent, so that the idea of actually paying fees is to come to university and receive a testament at the end of it. So you have a degree. And if a lot of money is being paid, the student often wants to do, is less interested in the content than actually receiving the testament. And we find there is that corrosion in terms of master's and doctoral degrees already occurring. And so there's a restriction of time, maybe that one can be enrolled for a PhD. And so it's in the university's interest because they will receive money, state money, for completions. So focuses on completion, not someone just enrolling and doing it. So, and the idea is to get someone through more quickly. And so the number of words is being contracted, and so and because there are more graduates, it's true that positions are more competitive, and so that the credentialism has increased, which you're referring to at the various levels. That is the reality at the moment. Did you want to comment on that?
Ina has shared her spot. Hi. So my name is Kate, and I actually just started my JD, my first year of my JD 3 weeks ago. So I'm even much newer to this than you are. But I actually have a question about the definition of the technopreneur and this idea. And I'm coming from it from the Canadian context of two different language learning environments that we have, English and French, and coming from Montreal, where there's really quite a very, I think, different tradition and value of what education is. And I also lived in France for a while, where there's also a very, very different educational ideals. And I'm wondering about, in terms of the definition of this new technopreneur, I'm wondering if you've thought about, or if you took into account the space of techno-jargon, and especially the influence of Silicon Valley innovation, community, techno language and vocabulary into everything from grant writing to teaching. And I guess what I'm wondering is, if it's two-pronged, is if there's a way in which a resistance to this technopreneurialship in academia could come from, first of all, countries and communities which are not primarily English language speaking, and so who by nature are outside of this jargon in this language. And so this, I think, ranking by subsequently. And then also, if for ourselves as academics or professionals or teachers, there's a way in which a resistance could be trying to be a carefulness and attentiveness to the way in which we use this language. Anyways, so that's my question.
Certainly I've been interested in that move towards the technocratic. What is privilege? So what is privilege now is know-how rather than know what. So it's not, knowledge as such, but how you can apply it. And so this is, the technical application, technocratic application, whether it's in law or whatever. So I haven't thought about it beyond that in the terms that you're talking about, and the way it might be used in different cultures, because I've focused mainly on, I've focused on English-speaking cultures, and because they're the ones I'm familiar with. And in terms of law, there is a commonality in these various jurisdictions, and so it was easier to talk about, globalization in those terms. And it would be, I think, beyond me and very ambitious to be looking, at other linguistic understandings. But maybe that's a project for you to undertake.
Okay, watch, this is how it's done. This conversation between these two star academics has been really world class. And we will, let me ask.
So am I doing concluding comments? Yes, okay. I wasn't sure if I was making comments. Yes. So I'd like to thank both Professor, and sorry, I'm just blanking out now.
That's all right.
Yes, Margaret, Professor Thornton, and Professor Code for this opportunity. First, it is, I have to say personally, just a wonderful opportunity to hear the two of you whose research I have valued for much of my career. So it's wonderful for all of us to be able to be here and have this opportunity, but also for raising issues that are so pertinent. And you know, what we can see from the conversation resonated so deeply for everyone in this room, and that is, how do we actually address academic capitalism, remembering that it's fundamentally gendered, and the issues of how do we resist, I think, are certainly ones that are very crucial, and ones that I think warrant larger discussions and continuing discussions. So thank you very much, Margaret, because your talk has inspired us to think much more critically and to continue to engage with these conversations. And I hope we'll be able to have you back so we can continue the conversation.